Hey everyone, welcome to the third video in our Beholding Jesus mini-series in these last couple chapters of Luke before the resurrection. Just to remind us, yesterday's video we finished with Jesus having been betrayed by Judas in the garden, sent to kind of the Jewish religious council where he was questioned, and yet he doesn't want to play their games. He knows that they're not going to believe him if he gives the truth, so he basically just says, that's what you say, yep, you say so. But he does, at the very end of yesterday's passage, he does make the affirmation, from now on the Son of Man will, what does he say? From now on the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. This amazing statement that no matter what trials are coming against Jesus at this time, the fulfillment of the Son of Man and his kingdom will come to pass. But let's continue to behold Jesus as we go into chapter 23, starting in verse 1. We read this: Then the whole company of them, that's the Jewish religious leaders, arose and brought him, Jesus, before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, You have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they were urgent, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place. Now what we have here is the Jewish religious leaders bringing Jesus to be tried by Rome, by Pilate. Why? Because Pilate has the authority in this time to bring up the death penalty on Jesus. And that's exactly what the Jewish religious leaders want. They want Jesus dead. So they bring him against Pilate and they try to accuse Jesus in front of Pilate on political grounds. He's making himself out to be a king. He's making himself out to be in opposition to Caesar, the true Lord. So, Pilate looks at Jesus and says, well, are you the king? Now, here's the thing. Jesus, like I just said earlier, Jesus knows that one of the characteristics of the power of darkness, the time of darkness, is unbelief. If he says to Pilate, yes, I am, release me, I'm the king, he's not going to believe him. So that's why he simply says, you have said so. Now, what's amazing now and throughout the rest of this passage is that Pilate, of all people, the Roman governor, who was actually in history apparently quite cruel and greedy, he pronounces not once but 3 times in this passage, he pronounces publicly the innocence of Jesus. I find no guilt in this man, coming from Pilate. And I love that, because God's using this wicked man, Pilate, to declare the truth about Jesus. Jesus is sinless. He's the sinless Lamb of God. Let's continue on. Verse 6, when Pilate heard this, that is when he heard that Jesus had been stirring up crowds, even from Galilee, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. So Herod was another Roman governor that was sort of had authority in the Galilee area. He was the son of Herod the Great. Now he was in Jerusalem along with Pilate because of the Passover, and there's tons of Jews gathering in Jerusalem for this time of Passover. So verse 8 says this: when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. Jesus is just some magician spectacle for Herod. Verse 9, so he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. This fulfills the suffering servant in Isaiah 53:7, where he didn't say a word back. He didn't say a mumbling word. There's a song about that. Jesus fulfills the suffering servant from Isaiah 53. Verse 10, and just as a note there, how quickly we, if we were in that place, would want to justify ourselves, would want to prove our innocence, and yet Jesus, in fulfillment of the suffering servant, doesn't say a word. He's doing his Father's will. He's committing. He's determined to fulfill what God the Father has called him to. Verse 10, the chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Now it's kind of interesting to see here this negative foreshadow of the work of Jesus later on after the resurrection. We learn in places like Ephesians 3 that by Jesus and what he has done, he brings together two people who are at enmity, for example, Jews and Gentiles. He brings them and becomes the one man. He reconciles them. He makes them friends. And here, right at the death of Jesus, we see in a negative kind of shadow the coming together almost in this negative, against Jesus kind of way. Herod and Pilate, who are at once at enmity with one another, are now coming together in friendship as they sort of mock and treat Jesus as if he is nothing. It's sort of this weird type before the resurrection where we'll see God bringing together all sorts of people from every tribe, nation, and tongue, maybe who are at enmity with one another, together in friendship, together in one body. Verse 13, Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty." There's the second instance of Pilate declaring Jesus innocent. "I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him, neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." Right? I will therefore punish and release him. Again, imagine being Jesus, hearing the words from the man with the most authority right now, saying, "I don't see anything worthy of death. I will punish him just to appease you, but I'm not going to put him to death." And yet, look at verse 18. "But they all cried out together." You see this union against Jesus, this coming together of kind of this union of evil against Jesus. It reminds me of Psalm chapter 2, where you have all the kings and the nations conspiring together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Except tragically, this is Israel. This is God's people coming together, unified in voice, saying, "No, we're crying out together because we do not want Jesus to live." They say in verse 18, "Away with this man and release to us Barabbas." Now, what do they mean by here? Barabbas was a man, in fact, let's just read verse 19. This is a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Here's a true criminal, okay? A true criminal that they are saying, "Release for us Barabbas instead of Jesus," because at the festival, the custom was at this time for the governor, for Pilate, to release one prisoner during this festival. So they're saying, "Keep Jesus, who's in custody right now, put him to death. Release for us Barabbas, who is a true criminal." What a terrible contrast between the two. Jesus is the truly innocent one, and yet they are saying, "Hey, pronounce innocence on Barabbas. Give us Barabbas, the true guilty one, because we in our minds see Jesus as the true guilty one." Verse 20, Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death." There's the third instance of him declaring Jesus innocent. "I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And then listen to this last phrase in verse 23, so profound. It says this, "And their voices prevailed." Just consider the strength of the united voice. In fact, we actually kind of see that in our culture today. If there's a group of people that say things really loudly, oftentimes it prevails and it messes with people's moral compass. Or maybe it doesn't even mess with people's moral compass, but they just say, "You know what? They're being so loud that I'm just going to give in to their cries." That's exactly what we see here. Pilate gives in to the cries of the people because their voices prevailed. Verse 24, so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. How sad for a ruler to give in to the cries of the people, even when it goes against justice. Verse 25, he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. This is the power of darkness. This is their hour. This is the will of the evil one, you could say. And yet, what was Jesus saying in the garden just yesterday? Or at least in our understanding, it was yesterday in our video. Jesus said, not my will, but your will be done. Amazingly, and this is something that I can't fully comprehend, but God's will sometimes works through the will of others, even through the will of others who are evil and to blame, the ones that are truly guilty. So behold Jesus, again, declared innocent 3 times, and yet he doesn't try to justify himself. He doesn't raise his voice to try to get out of the situation, but he continues to move along the path that his Father has sent him on for the great salvation of the world. We'll see you tomorrow for our 4th video.